Welcome to Elemental Energy, the podcast where we discuss how to simplify decarbonization. Here, we will introduce emerging low-carbon energy technologies and give you insight on how to navigate and support the evolving energy landscape. It is our goal to develop content to give you confidence to help transition the market and make low-carbon energy reliable and affordable. I'm your host, Marcia Leonard. Today's episode of Elemental Energy is a really interesting one. I have been wanting to understand the origination story of CCUS, carbon capture utilization story, for a while now. We know this needs to happen. We know what's going on, but how are we actually making it a reality? And I have a very nice friend, Heath Lovell, who stepped on to join us at Elemental Energy today to talk about carbon capture utilization and storage and the origin stories. How are we actually making these projects become a reality? Heath, welcome to Elemental Energy. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit further, please, for the rest of our listeners.
Okay, my name is Heath Lovell. I've been in energy development for almost 20 years now, most of that oil and gas. I've spent some time in solar, most recently carbon capture, and my expertise kind of falls within origination, specifically lease and land origination for energy development projects. And I'm most excited about carbon capture because I think it's the most efficient way to make the progress that we need to make to accommodate some of these net zero metrics and goals that are getting rolled out by different businesses.
Very well stated. I agree with you that it is one of the most applicable measures to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And a couple of months ago, I had the pleasure of listening to Jennifer Wilcox. She works with the Department of Energy, and she is actually trying to help with the permitting side of CCUS. And the biggest part of these projects is that they have to have a robust community engagement plan. You have to have the community engaged with these types of projects. Give us the origin story. What's going on? Let's take it a step back even further. How did you even get involved to even start talking to landowners about how to originate these projects, and where is it applicable?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about that. Really, when you break down energy development in general, they all have to have kind of similar pieces to the puzzle or the same kind of recipe. You need your site control, you need your permit, and then, of course, you need your stakeholder engagement, and that's very much tethered to the permitting process. There are very much challenges right now on the permitting side of carbon capture. A lot of those challenges, quite frankly, could be solved with development comprehension. That's really what the bottleneck is for most of these projects right now. And then the other bottleneck on the permitting side, and I'm sure she mentioned it, is, they only have so much manpower over there, and they're new to it too. So they're new to permitting these projects. The developers are new to developing these projects, and everybody's trying to race to the finish to prop up their regulatory framework. And then you have case law that could come into play that could affect projects and then thereby affect the regulatory framework for these projects. So there's a lot of unknowns currently. And, there's a lot of permits out there that are pending. And a function of that is because the queues are inundated with permit applications for carbon capture projects currently. And the EPA is the one that's set up for most processes to regulate and permit projects. And then there is what's called primacy. And that's when a state can go through their own process and approve it through legislation, and then they regulate their own carbon capture projects.
How did you start on this journey in CCUS? It's so new for some, but let's hear how you got into this world.
Well, you hear it from everybody, the 10,000 hours. And then how did Heath Lovell get 10,000 hours of carbon capture? And I would argue by now I have it. In my last role, I got most of it, right? And I was part of a small company and I was on the BD team. And I was one of the few people that actually understood and comprehended how these projects were developed. And the reason being is I just reverse engineered the development contracts to better understand the framework and what goes into the terms and conditions for these projects. So it was processed by having to, right? I mean, there was 2 months last year where I worked 2 months solid, 12 to 16 hours a day without one day off. And I probably churned out 15 to 20 pitch decks for the board at that time. So really what was happening is I was working so much and so hard and prospecting so aggressively. I literally ended up almost evaluating every emission stream in the country that was over 1 million tons per year, and where the storage facility or the sink, I like sink, some people say storage facility, but that confuses landowners. Yeah, so I was forced into that and I learned so much so quickly as a land professional and what had to be done to get these projects to move forward, because a lot of groups are really struggling with that. They're stuck and they're waiting either on regulatory framework or capital or the emitter. There's all these different moving parts and they're just literally stuck. They're sitting there. So that's kind of what's going on with the permitting. I can go on and on about it. I will say she's making great progress over there. For example, Louisiana most recently just was able to establish primacy to permit their own projects. There's a few other states. I know Texas is considering it. Colorado is considering it. And primacy will really enhance that permit application process because it will alleviate some of that load off of the EPA.
Keith, give me the secret sauce in an ideal
Okay.
situation of how to make a CCUS project come to be, or just a carbon capture project come to be with storage, since utilization is
Okay.
still a little bit out there.
Okay, so let me answer that. There's different ways to do that. You have different groups with different investment strategies. When you look at the EPA permit queue, you can see all the different developers and companies with permits pending. And when you go through that list of developers and companies with permits pending, I think there's only 5, 6 or so pure pre-revenue development operations, right? All of the other groups in the permit queues have cash flow or their business units of E&P groups or big renewable development companies, utility companies. Those are the groups that can pay to play and marinate on their permits. Really, what it comes down to is there's different strategies at play. Your midstream groups naturally are trying to connect projects. The challenge with that is they're getting out in front of the developers before they're commercializing projects. And they're stirring up the stakeholders before they get all their permits lined up and everything else. So all of that chaos with connectivity is now coming into the development of the actual project, because all those landowners go to the same coffee shops, same restaurants, the same feed stores, the same churches, and they all talk to each other and they all know what's going on. And that's what's really happening there. But in my opinion, there are projects out there that pencil. And what we need as a group and as an industry are commercial projects to point to, control point with economic models that we can evaluate and learn from and use to our advantage when we're developing our own economic models for our own projects. I can't tell you how many inputs that are in these economic models for these projects that are kind of roundabout guesses. How much is pipe? How much is this? How much is that? There's question marks next to a lot of those questions. And when you're developing an economic model for a project, you have to assume. So my answer to that is you need to find a project with enough room in the economic model where you can get the project to pencil. And these economic models have very thin margins. And the ones with the thinnest margins are the ones that are trying to get strung together with connectivity by a midstream group. So naturally, that permitting activity is making those projects difficult. There are plenty of projects throughout the country where the emitter is also the pore space owner. And when you own 100% of the economic model, you have plenty of room in your margins, right? I say plenty, even that's not a lot of room. And the way you unlock these suckers is you have to align resources with upside in your project to accommodate these development hurdles. Everybody's being really stingy with their capital and nobody's opening up the economic model because there's not really room. Well, let's find the projects with room. Let's develop those. Let's commercialize those. Let's use those as examples. And then let's branch out from there and connect the whole dadgum country. But I think the groups that have a few of these independent projects, like your Oxys and some of these other groups, Exxon, if you noticed, they don't have 15, 20 projects connected together. They have one or two or three that are their projects, and they're developing those to commercialization because they're not relying on 50 other groups involved with stakeholders to acquire their own permits and their own hurdles. So the answer to that question is, let's find a power plant with a volume profile of emissions that's high enough, and the storage facility or the sink that's close enough to the project with the right porosity, and let's independently develop that to commercialization. And then we can take the information we learn from that and we can use that and establish efficiencies through the development process and learn. Case law will come in and affect development. And all of that will help lower the capex for these suckers. Anyway, I can tell I'm talking a long time, so I digress and let you talk.
No, I'm glad you're talking a long time because I am learning as you are talking, but let's talk about how the money and what the market for carbon capture projects is. I mean, this is engineered carbon removal is what a CCU or carbon capture project is used for. So the customer base is like the airline companies, their teams. I know that for DAX Stratus, the Houston Astros have signed up to have they're offsetting their carbon footprint by buying engineered carbon credits. So what I'm hearing from you right now is that, they're going out to these customers and they're trying to have buy-in, but you're saying that it's adding more complexity because the ideal situation is that it sounds like a utility space provider and injecting directly on site, but by adding in these customers early, it's making it too complex. Did you
Well,
say
it's just the
correctly?
connect. Really, when you boil it down, it's you have different strategies at play. And really, the only strategy, in my opinion, right now are commercial projects. And if your commercial project is relying on a completely different strategy to be commercialized, then you could be just sitting there waiting on this group to get their stuff together. The point I'm making is let's find the projects that do pencil and let's develop those instead of everybody trying to compete in the market and run out to grab everything they can. You know, Exxon, Oxy, they say, hey, there's a power plant. We have assets in the area. We have emissions, there's volumes. We're friends with this utility. They have emissions and volumes. Let's do our project here. And that will secure these volumes and it solves problems for us, solves problems for the utility, for the government, for the stakeholders. That's really what I think needs to happen. Are more groups need to focus on independently developing projects that pencil instead of having to string together projects to have enough to make them pencil, right? Because okay, I bring this project online. That's 500 million tons a year. My target is 10 million tons. So I got to get this plant, this plant, this plant, over 2 or 3 states. And then my economic model comes together and everything pencils. Whereas let's take this plant with this many volumes, that pencils on its own.
So I understand your point of your ideal model would be on site capture and storage? Because I'm trying to relate this back into like even our midstream sector of like pipelines. PHMSA, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, hasn't even come up with the full regulations around pipelines for CO2 transportation yet. Like, this is something that they are still trying to undergo. There are CO2 lines that are out there, but due to some previous issues, I think there was a rupture back in 2020. They're still trying to figure out the regulations around the pipeline. So I get that. But what do you see for the utilization side? Because if you just have these large utilities players who are putting it directly into their sites, like, what is it going to do then? Just sit there and have somebody come and get it for utilization?
Hey, you hit the nail on the head. That you would be shocked at how many people can't get to that conclusion. And that's where we're at. If I were to use the U in CCUS, it would be carbon capture, you come to the sink or you come to the project, and sequestration. I don't see when you look at these economic models, there's not an input for this end user market where you can get returns from your carbon. We're not there yet. It's fun to talk about and it's important, and we need that propped up for this industry to make sense, for there to be a robust carbon market. But right now, you can't rely on that in your economic model because of the midstream challenges. We can't just deliver carbon to everybody, right? That's what's There are groups out there raising capital under the assumption that carbon will be delivered to their area or their business. That's why they're creating hubs. These hubs for hydrogen and carbon are being driven by lots of things, but one of the things is storage, your sink. You need that for hydrogen, you need that for geothermal, you need that for carbon capture. In storage, you can't just find any storage opportunity. There are only certain areas of geology that have the right subsurface characteristics for a project that's economical. So they're driving the businesses to the areas where that is, because you can't just go to New York and say, hey, we're going to do a project and we're going to take your volumes and put them 30 miles that way. No, when I see New York, I think I got to grab your volumes. I've got to ship them all the way down the East Coast and find a sink somewhere in the deep South that's capable of accommodating your volumes. So that's kind of what I was getting at with that.
Talking about the ideal customers in this space, we keep mentioning utilities as that ideal customer, but how do we make them start capturing their carbon without, the implementation of fines or policy? Like, what is it that's going to make them start to capture their carbon?
So let's talk about that question, and it can be answered in different ways. And depending upon your answer, it may upset one side of the spectrum or the other. First off, you used a word right out the gate that just makes any conversation difficult. Make. How do we make the utilities? I don't want to make the utilities do anything. I want to show them how to make money and how to learn how to develop these projects to their advantage for their businesses, that injects capital into their company and all of that good stuff. I don't want to be pointing fingers at anybody and saying, you're bad. You need to take your emissions and you need to do business with me and put it here, or to an oil and gas company and say the same thing. I want to go to these groups and say, hey, man, you got a problem. And there's people out there that want to make you do something with that. Well, I don't want to make you do anything, but I can help you understand what that is and understand what the economics are behind capturing that and doing something with it, and where you can put it and how that can be good for your business. Because what's happening in our culture today are these forceful actions, making, threatening. That's what generates your clickbait. I've been in touch recently with some of these utility executives, and they don't like the fact that developers are coming to them. And I was one of these guys recently. And you call them up and you say, you're bad. I looked at your volumes on the EPA website. You've got 9.5 million tons coming out of your plant right here. You have to take that and put it in the ground, and you need me to do it. No, it's hey, you got this little problem here, and let's do something about it. That's step one, is not trying to scare them into the sink or force them into the sink. Let's show them how they can get in there and make it make sense to them. And I think you'll find that they'll start wanting to be part of these projects. I mean, I want to say something and I'm probably kick myself in the butt, but if I were a utility executive, it's coming. It doesn't matter what you do, what you say. It doesn't matter if it's Trump, Biden, Democrat, Republican, it's coming and it's going to get forced. And you can either prepare for what's coming or you can react to what's coming. And if I was a utility executive right now, I would hire me, I would hire the best geologist I could find and a midstream guy and a few others. And I would be thinking, how can I control the market? How can I control all the storage for every molecule of CO2 in our atmosphere? That's my goal. I want to control everybody's storage facility or everybody's sink. So I'm going to lease up all of these projects and storage facilities, and I'm going to control where all of my competitors need to take their CO2 and deposit it. And I don't understand why there's nobody doing that. I mean, it's the same concept as oil and gas leasing. It's very similar. It's a lot harder. Your basic oil and gas leasing guy can't do it, and your basic renewable developer can't do it. But anyway, I'm going on another tangent. I'll stop there, let you ask more questions.
Heath, I don't bring just anybody on elemental energy. I bring on visionaries and I bring on people who are making changes. And the reason that you may have asked the question, you don't understand why nobody's doing it yet, maybe because nobody's had that visionary put that idea in front of them before. I'm just saying that, and I'm putting that out there. And another mindset shift. Thank you. It's not about making them do it. It's about how do we make them money? How do we turn the allure of capturing carbon into something that makes economical sense to make them money? And that's something that even in the oil and gas sector, instead of flaring, instead of releasing or having methane leaks not detected, you want to keep product in there because that's all money being released. So if you could think about ways to keep that money in the pipeline, pun intended, it's kind of the same situation that I'm thinking of with these utilities is how do you make these projects economically viable and making them money? So, okay.
Well, commercial projects is the first step. It shows people it can be done, and then you see how much money you can make, and you use that data. I recently was in a debate, and I slid into the DM of this utility executive, CEO of one of the largest utilities in our country, and I sent it out in the ether, and he within 30 seconds, I didn't think he'd respond. Within 30 seconds, I get this long response. And the mistake I made is I was being preachy. We just talked about it, about volumes, this, that, and the other. Really, another red flag with these utilities, this will be quick, is these costs got to get passed down to their rate base, right? So they have to make sense of that also. And that's why you need to open up the economic model for some of these. Tell you what, if you're dealing with a billionaire landowner or an executive of an energy company and you go to him with your lowest offer and you're not willing to give him upside in your project to align him in your project like you do with oil and gas projects, you're not going to get a deal, period. He's going to hold out. But anyway, that I digress.
These are all good things because it helps give people the perceptions of what we're going through, what it's taking to get these projects to come to fruition, to be coming to a reality. Another statistic that I just thought was crazy, I had to go back to my notes from this summit that I was invited to. I got to hear Jennifer Wilcox talk about these permitting issues. Is back in November, there were 0 phase 4 permitting. There were 14 projects in phase 3, and there were 17 projects in phase 2. And I know that you were talking about the whole implication of them being over inundated. There are so many people who are applying for these permits. But what I was even thinking of further is going back to community engagement and that landowner situation. Like expand on that because that is
Yeah.
one of your bailiwicks as well as the landowners of how do we educate these people of what they're getting themselves into and the possibilities that it might open up for them.
let's talk about that too, and let's open that up. When you break that down, your stakeholder engagement for these projects is a lot different than a solar array or you know an oil and gas project. Way different. And the reason being is you're trying to sell an iPhone to a caveman. And I don't mean that by their intellect ability, just it's this new thing and they don't understand it. And everybody's like, well, we got these timelines. Let's go, 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 go. It's hard. I mean, I've recently tried to raise some capital for some of this stuff. And you get in these meetings with some of these really incredibly intelligent people, and they don't even get it. So that needs what's funny is they don't get it and then they expect you to force that down a landowner's throat and for them to get it quicker. So one, it takes a long time for people to understand what these projects are, what goes into them, and what's in it for them, what are the risks involved and the dangers and all of that. And then you have a midstream component and you've got drill bits and pipelines, but you're saving the planet and you're capturing carbon. And then there's geology. That's a lot to talk about. And if you think about it, this can be a conversation for hydrogen. It can be a conversation for geothermal. It can be a conversation for carbon capture, because when you look and you reverse engineer those development contracts, they're very similar. The contracts are very similar in the way that the stages those projects are developed. So you want your customer base and your stakeholders comfortable with what the heck you're doing. And remember, these customers and these landowners are used to renewable development projects that generate returns, robust returns that aren't propped up necessarily with a subsidy. Maybe some do, maybe some don't, whether it's hydrogen, whatever. But regardless, you're dealing with a waste product and carbon capture, and you have to make your stakeholders understand that. But my point is you just really, when it comes down to any of these, the first time to engage your stakeholder was yesterday. That's always the answer. If I ask a young land professional or a developer, when's the best time to engage your stakeholder on one of these projects? The answer better always be yesterday, because that's my answer. And, you have some of these midstream groups too that are doing it. They're going and they're reusing old right of way. Some of these right of ways, who knows how long they've been there? They're blanket right of ways that give them the rights for carbon or CO2 pipelines. But they're not going to that landowner who signed that contract 30 years ago and saying, we're now going to use this for CO2. So when you take their right of way and you're trying to permit a CO2 line, and all of a sudden they're like, whoa, you're going to use that going from my land on CO2? We didn't talk about that. So instead of going to your permit process, go to your landowner. Hey, this right of way is going to be used for a carbon capture project, and we're going to have to permit for a carbon capture project, and you're going to see it listed when it's presented to the public. And you know what we have to do? We can't use the pipe that's there. We can't use any of the pipe because it has to be CO2 spec pipe. We have to take all the old pipe out and put new CO2 pipe in. So if you're using existing right of ways, you have to have that conversation. And I guarantee you, Navigator was not doing that on their project. And I bet some of those landowners came around 30 years later and were like, I had no clue that my right of way was going to be used for a CO2 pipeline. So stakeholder engagement and development comprehension, and you will have to meet with these stakeholders until you turn blue in the face and explain the development time and time again. And it takes me 6 to 8 months sometimes in my negotiations till I can get a stakeholder comfortable with how the projects are developed enough to do business and negotiate their contract.
I am so curious. What if I was a landowner? What does the compensation model even look like for this CO2 storage or movement? Because usually it's like, with minerals, it's you get paid for what is coming out of the ground, or with renewables, it's you get paid for what's generated. But what does compensation look like in this area?
This is a very dynamic question. I'll give you the best answer I have. And that's not my wheelhouse. But, the incentives in the business in general, if you're not getting the credits, the carbon credits, or if you're not generating the returns as the operator or the developer of the project. They're very small and thin. And quite frankly, that's what makes it hard to get these deals done. Because when you're using volumetric based contracts, I don't care what people say. A solar and a wind contract are not volumetric. Now, wind could be and solar could be if it was using to develop, the power was being used to develop hydrogen, but they're not volumetric based contracts. And farmers, when you approach them with a development contract that is volumetric based, whether it's for a waste product or it's an energy or a mineral that you're using to develop energy, they got dollar signs tattooed on the insides of their eyelids, and they're thinking money, money, money. Well, they do pay well, but they don't pay that great. So the way that these projects are structured, specifically for carbon capture, 45Q of the Inflation Reduction Act has provided a structure that you can use with your economic model that kind of props up the framework for a royalty structure or a rental structure. You can tenor a certain percentage per metric million or per million ton of CO2 injected, I believe is what it is. Anyway, it's changed with time. It started low, and the federal government wasn't seeing projects come online. So with time, they've nudged that metric. It's up to 84, 80, somewhere like 84, 85 in that ballpark right now. That's what you tether your contract to. And then you say, okay, the operator is this percent of the 45Q, the landowner is this percent of 45Q, and the emitter is this percent. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Problem is that metric is pretty low right now. And if you have a project with thin margins, you're talking a few bucks an acre, right, for a development contract. But if you have a project with good margins, you can get more aggressive. Or if you have your company with a lot of cash flow, you can get really aggressive. But really, it's finessing your stakeholders. And, just like oil and gas, and I've learned this in renewable development in general, renewable developers don't like open up the economic model. They hate it. They don't even want to talk about it. Oil and gas is the opposite, man. They're like overrides, non-participating royalties. Let's give you a little percentage of this revenue stream. So you're approaching landowners on a volumetric contract with very thin margins, and it's hard for a farmer or a rancher to understand why those margins are thin and that you're dealing with a waste product and not a barrel of oil or a gas molecule. And that makes it hard to get deals done.
I can see wholeheartedly now why those utility providers and power generation is the ideal customer if they have the land, if they have the space, because it's less to control, less engagement.
What the best way, in my opinion, to get these deals done, and I've kind of mentioned it, is opening up the model a little bit or finding ways to budget your development contract where you're de-risking it to the point with your commercial terms, and you're adding as many adders as you can on with upside after the project is approved and it's going towards commercial activity. Because at that point, you've secured your volumes, you've secured this, you've got more capital from your private equity group, and you can afford that burden. And people that can't get there, like back, just like this simple, oil and gas uses this all the time, renewables do too, but back in after payout. Now, a project that's like $50 billion backing in after payout doesn't sound like a great place to have your upside. But in an oil and gas well, you back in it, those well bores will pay out a year to 2 years, and then you back in with a higher interest after the project's paid for. Simple things like that, where you can structure your development contract to really get somebody excited about what's down the road for them. And I think that's really where the opportunity is right now in negotiating some of these dynamic agreements, is finding ways to delay the upside or punt it towards where everybody is participating and making money when the project's commercial.
Okay. Let's end this conversation on a positive note. What does your heaven look like when it comes down to CO2 capture, storage, utilization? Like, what do you want to see in 1 year for this area in this industry?
In 1 year, I would like to see Texas get primacy. I would like to see Colorado get primacy and New Mexico get primacy. Essentially, I would like the states in the Midwest and the, what are you, Bible Belt or whatever, get primacy. That's where most of the great porosity is. I would like to see the renewable groups and the oil and gas groups and the legislators work together to better understand these projects, because all they're doing is getting in each other's way and they're letting politics drive some of that. And it's silly. These carbon's not political. Really, it's going to take everybody. It's going to take oil and gas professionals, geologists, land professionals, originators, renewable developers, renewable engineers. Your oil and gas, fossil fuel professionals are better playing with drill bits, pipelines, and drilling rigs and subsurface development. Your renewable developers are better understanding utility plants, and they're better with their instruction manuals and Lego sets around utility plants and regulatory framework for projects, and getting these people in the same room and spitballing and brainstorming and working together to unlock opportunity. That's what I want to see this year. And utilities that see that are going to be the ones that succeed, and the people that understand, hey, I need to develop a project that I can commercialize. That's what wins the day. I hope that happens this year. And I hope people can start understanding that this doesn't have to be a renewable practice or a fossil fuel practice. This is a practice to take something that's a problem and do something with it, and allow both sides of that coin to develop more projects and generate more revenue and returns for their investors and make their stakeholders happy. And I think that that's how we're going to get there. And utilities are very much a part of it. And the last thing I'll say about that, I want your audience to think in terms of an iPhone, right? This a carbon capture project is an iPhone with rights to do something with everything you need to do with your iPhone. And every so often, there's going to be a new tech group that comes out with a new iPhone or a new capture tech device. And if you've got your project developed correctly and you're perpetuating a project, when that new group comes in with their fancy new capture tech that can capture 30% more than your old machine, you take your DAC device or whatever it may be, unplug it, plug in your new iPhone to your project, and you continue perpetuating, because these are hubs and businesses are going to flood to these areas, and then they're going to be long term. And if you control the storage, you control the destiny.
So, Heath, anybody who needs carbon capture help, please hire him, because he is the most amazing consultant that I have ever seen in this space. I've talked to a lot of CCUS folks, and his knowledge, everything is phenomenal. I'm so thankful to have you here. Secondly, if anybody needs help and you're listening to this from a customer's perspective of social engagement and community engagement, please connect with me or Heath. We can both help you in this space. And then lastly, Heath, I'm going to test my book title and my subtitle on you. I'm writing a book.
Cool.
And it pretty much summarizes that last bit that you just said. And the book's going to be called The Enlightenment of Energy. And it's about helping others understand the relationship of oil and gas to electricity and how both are critical.
I like it because it's gonna take it all. It's gonna take all forms of energy, whether it's fossil fuel or renewable, and it's gonna take them all working together to solve problems. And politicizing it it's not progress. And there's problems on both sides. And carbon capture, you have to be a chameleon. You have to be ready to pretend to be a Democrat, then you have to pretend to be a Republican, because every 10 seconds, one of those parties is upset.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Everybody stay happy, but most importantly, stay safe. And thank you so much for joining Heath and I on today's episode of Elemental Energy.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate this opportunity, and thank you so much for your time.
Holy mama. That episode was amazing. For one, like I said, Heath is a visionary when it comes down to how much he has poured into this space, how much time he has put into it. And he has really, like he said, reverse engineered from, contracts back, and even getting into the nitty gritty of landowners. Like, I just feel very lucky to know him, feel very lucky to call him a friend. And I am so excited to see moving forward the progression in the utility space for CCS. I think that's after hearing even more about all the stakeholders that are involved and all the other applications, it really does make a lot of sense of how do we make these projects economic in the less convoluted and less complex thing ability that we have, and it really does keep pointing back to utilities. Like, I just had never really thought of that in power generation space. So I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. I was sincere. If you are somebody who is needing help in that community engagement plan, early feasibilities, whatever the situation is for CCS, please get a hold of myself or even Heath. We're both very good resources to use in getting knowledge in this space.